So, you're developing your Power Platform solution, minding your own business, accepting new requirements as they come in from the business. You set up a dev, a test, a prod. Then you decide, maybe you need a UHC dedicated environment. And then you think, maybe you need two different prod organizations for these different apps. And then you realize that maybe you need to start planning for developer environments as well. And Dataverse for Teams might fit into this pattern too. And then suddenly you realize, it dawns on you, that the number of environments is spiraling out of control. You're not sure where customizations are anymore. Your ALM pipelines are wickedly complex, and you start to think, maybe I should have stopped to think this through. Don't worry. We've all been there. I've been doing this almost 15 years, and I kick myself for not thinking it through more times than I can count. Luckily, today, Garrett Pierce is here. He's going to walk us through some of the basics of Power Platform environment strategy development for pro devs, giving you his take on what pro devs need to know about this kind of strategy so that you can effectively advocate for the strategic elements that make the most sense from your technical perspective. We'll walk through some of the basic terminology, major organizational and security priorities, and then get into some of the meat of how this kind of strategy should be formulated. We will not be telling you what your strategy is because every organization is different, every dev team is different, but hopefully by the end of this you'll walk away with some tools and tricks for coming up with the strategy that makes the most sense for your team. Okay, Garrett, so let's start us off. Let's start with something basic, right? What is an environment strategy? But remember, we're talking about Power Platform governance from a pro dev perspective. So I want you to try and break your answer into two parts if you could. What does environment strategy mean from a technical perspective, that speeds and feeds kind of answer? And what does environment strategy mean at more of an organizational level?
Yeah. From a technical, developer's perspective, a good environment strategy is essentially just something that's going to make your life easier. And as devs, we love stuff that makes our life easier, right? So, that's probably the biggest thing is that you'll want to have things laid out in a logical fashion. You'll want to know where your data sits, where your customizations sit, all that kind of stuff. So, from a technical perspective, that's kind of what you're looking at. But from a more organizational perspective, an environment strategy will be a plan to support growth and efficiency within an organization that uses Power Platform. And kind of like you said up front, there's not like a one-size-fits-all sort of solution, and so we won't be giving you an exact solution, but rather we'll kind of be creating a toolbox for you to use and giving you a better baseline understanding. Because this is a thing that needs to kind of grow and change and evolve with the needs of your organization. So,
okay, good. All right, so the next obvious spot, and we probably shouldn't spend too much time on this one, but before we get into the details of a strategy, we should define environment types, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've got a bunch of different types of environments. First and foremost, you'll have the default environment, right? And that's what comes with every single tenant. There's that default environment. It's usually labeled default, and it's, in the header. And it is kind of, if you're trying to have good governance, you don't want to use the default environment all that much because it doesn't kind of come with the same, safeguards and that kind of thing that you can put in the other environments. So it's definitely not intended for long-term or permanent work, except for things that are personal productivity and probably won't be used by very many people. So we will actually probably spend a little bit more time here in the coming weeks talking about how to manage the default environment, because it is something that kind of warrants its own
some strategy, right?
Yeah, exactly. It warrants its own day in the sun to talk about, but we will get to that here soon, so we're not going to spend too much time on it now. But just know, you don't really want to be using the default environment for very many things. It does not want to be a major factor in your environment strategy overall.
Right.
Yeah. So jumping ahead, we have the production environment, which, unlike the default environment, is in fact intended for permanent work in your organization and supports extended backup retention for up to 28 days, which if your stuff is changing pretty frequently, it is good to have that sort of long-term backups because, you never know when you'll actually need to jump back a week in time and you're able to do that. So, quite useful. Next up, we have sandbox environments, which are good for testing and ALM building. They are where you'll where you will want to actually begin creating your customizations, where you'll want to mess around and experiment and all that good stuff. But it's not something you actually want to have your user base using as their daily use environment. So,
For
an
one thing, it
important
says sandbox across the top, right?
exactly, yeah, it'll tell you, it'll very openly tell you it is a sandbox, and that means that it's not meant for production use. Next up, we've got the developer environment, which is intended to be a workspace for makers to have for their personal development. And each maker can have up to 3 of those, and they, nicely enough, don't count against tenant capacity. But they kind of come with a caveat that you can't use D365 apps there. So
Yeah,
it
and you have a
is,
limited user count too, right? You can
yeah, I
only
think that's
share
true
it with
too. Yeah.
like 3 or 4 users or something.
Yeah, so it's kind of meant to be, the beginning to lay the groundwork for development and be useful for like personal productivity tools. So that's kind of where you'll want to start with that. The next up, you've got trial environments, which are, intended for things that are short term, like, brief little testing runs or like proof of concept kind of things that you're trying to get done quick and, maybe not necessarily trying to have in the long term, but you're just trying to get it done quick and
And these
dirty, I
are
guess. Yeah.
eligible for D365 solutions, right? I think they
Yes,
are.
I believe
Yeah.
so. Yeah. And you can only have one of these per user in your group there. The next up, Charles mentioned this earlier in the opening segment, but we have Dataverse for Teams environments, which are automatically created when you put an app into Teams or install an app from the app catalog. And that'll kind of have your security be in lockstep with the team that it's associated with. So this is a good thing to know. But
I
overall,
love these. I love
yeah,
Dataverse. I think it doesn't get enough love out there.
yeah,
Practically
underrated.
free, essentially free licensing. There's a
Hmm.
good amount of storage. You can still do a lot of customization. You can't do everything, but you can
Yeah.
still do quite a bit. And I mean, you can get a lot done in a D4T environment
Hmm.
for very little money.
Yeah, yeah. I need to play with that a little bit more personally.
Yeah.
And then finally, I think this is the last one. You have the support environment, which will be environments that are actually created by folks over at Microsoft Support to allow their engineers to troubleshoot issues. So not a lot to know there. And then yeah, finally we have managed environments,
Right.
which are something else that we'll probably spend time talking about in a different video, because they kind of warrant a little bit more exploration. But essentially, they provide a set of capabilities, kind of guardrails, that sort of thing that make it easier to scale and manage the environments. You've got things like usage insights, sharing limits, extended backups, pipelines, and environment routing. So
Yeah. They
yeah,
give you a lot of those COE like administrative
yeah,
capabilities
exactly.
without needing a COE necessarily.
Hmm.
Um, but all the users in that environment have to have premium, right? So now you can't skimp on your licenses if you're using those.
Yeah, exactly. So now that we've kind of laid the base of what environments you can work with, we're going to jump ahead and figure out a little bit about environment strategy. So one of the best things you can do to actually begin your environment strategy is to start with your data. And you can ask questions like, where do we need to store the data? What data is being stored? Who needs to access that data? And what other data sources do we need to talk to? And those kind of questions will probably end up governing how you build out your environment strategy. And it kind of gives you the answers to those questions may give you some ideas on how you want to organize your data, because you'll have a bunch of different things that you can consider. Like, you will have regional data. Like, if your company or organization that you're building for is in more than one country, you'll kind of want to consider that and make sure that like your environments are related to a data center that is in the proper region, that will make things move a little quicker for everybody. And you might need to
Right.
duplicate environments in different regions too, and depending on local laws and that sort of thing. So it's worth considering.
Right. And if you've got operations in Tokyo and New York, not everyone deals with that problem, but some people do.
Yeah.
Well, you better have an idea for that, because you don't want your Tokyo users having to call to the East U.S. Azure region for
Yeah.
every transaction.
Exactly. Yeah, those underwater cables, they can only handle so much, right?
Mhm.
um, yeah, and then what types of data is also very important to consider,
Yeah.
because a lot of organizations have data that's like very valuable or very sensitive, and maybe even sensitive enough to warrant its own environment, so that you can have, your own separate security protocols and that sort of thing around that specific set of data that with that sensitivity level. So
Yeah, I think this is probably a much more common constraint that people would want to
yeah,
put into their strategy than geography, right? There's
right.
only so many companies out there that really pivot around geographic constraints, for their
Mhm.
data, but everybody's got more important and less important data, more
Yeah,
sensitive and less sensitive data, and knowing that, identifying that up front, even if at the end of the day you decide, it's okay, it can all go into one environment,
hmm,
it still might shape how you build your security model, still might shape how you build your testing model. When are you going to introduce real data for testing? Are you going to introduce real data for testing, or are you just going to wait until production? Things like
yeah,
this, these are important questions.
yeah, and it also kind of it begs the question of like what's easier in terms of, we're trying to make devs lives easier, right? And so like what's easier than building a tangled web of security rules? Well, putting your important data in a separate environment altogether, and then making sure only certain people, the necessary people, have access to that environment. That is a great way to keep your life easy as a dev, and to, work within those bounds of security much easier. So yeah. And actually, on that note, access to data is another very important consideration. And like I just said, access management becomes a lot easier if your data is segregated very sensibly, right? And so like your important data, your high value, your, I guess low access, you could say, data, if that's in its own spot, that'll be a whole lot easier. Oh yes, we love our pets here at Practical Power Platforms. um, yeah, I actually keep looking over to see and make sure I don't back into the cat. Anyway,
Yeah, as you can tell, it's a dog household here.
yeah. I'm actually surprised the cat hasn't jumped up on my desk. But anyway, and then finally, our considerations will go to connecting to data, because in this similar way that it's easier to build security around sensibly segregated data, it is easier to enforce DLP boundaries if those connectors that you're working with in DLP are dedicated to certain environments. And if you remember, we talked about DLP in some past videos. It's data loss prevention rules. So yeah, it's a pretty important concept here when you're talking
Yeah.
about governance. So
Yeah, and breaking up the data based on these factors is important, right? Not just the data and the connectors both. The ability to secure this information takes forethought, right? You can't
mhm.
just figure it out after the fact and try and jam it in. Well, I guess you could, but it's going to be really hard to try and
Yeah,
jam these
exactly.
things after the fact. But
Yeah.
if you do it up front, then you're protected when you get to um, somebody wanting to do data replication, right? You want to start replicating your data off into a Power BI location for doing reporting, but you haven't effectively, built a data separation strategy.
Mhm.
Well, now you're going to be replicating data that in Dataverse is totally secured by roles, but over in Power BI, not so much,
Yeah.
right? You gotta plan these things forward.
Yeah. Most definitely. Um, so continuing on the point about DLP, um, those two kind of work in tandem. Like a data loss prevention strategy is going to impact your environment strategy, and similarly, your environment strategy is going to impact your data loss prevention strategy. Those two work hand in hand, and you need to consider both alongside each other, because they're very, very interlocked. I guess is what I want to say. Yeah. Um, another way another way you can develop your environment strategy is to begin developing your environment strategy, one of the best things to do is you start with reviewing your existing environments. That means jumping into the Power Platform admin view, which is a quick and easy way to see all the existing environments. You can export that to Excel, which makes it easy to kind of view that data if you're an Excel person. look and see if there's any environments that can be deleted. You may in fact have some inactive or outdated environments that you may have even completely forgotten about, and don't really cross your mind until you're actually taking a critical look there. And then look through your existing environments to nail down some themes. You might have different business areas, like sales and marketing may not exactly need to work out of the same environment, right? But or maybe they do, and so that's something you have to consider. You also, again, want to consider high value solutions. So, things that are very important, like data sensitivity, you got to consider when you're, looking at the current environments. So, yeah.
I like this, Garrett. So we start. We had a high level framework of those concerns and the topics around like security and the security perspective on it and how your environment strategy marries in with that. And now we're getting down into the weeds, right? Which is so important, right?
Yeah.
As devs, we kind of live down here. This is where
Exactly.
we live, right?
Yeah.
These are the steps that we need to start taking when we're gonna.
Right.
Somebody says, "Hey, it's time for our enterprise to come up with an environment strategy." You need to be aware. These are the things you want to be watching for, right? Because this is where it's going to hit you, right? This is where it's going to hit the developer. You got to be
Yeah.
sure that all the environments have been identified and people have given that thought, right? That you've walked through what's in place and how you've organized your business units and so on beforehand, right? This is excellent stuff.
Yeah, you want to be able to answer that. Well, what about this environment question? Because
That's
that
right.
might come up, and you want to be able to say, "Oh, well, that environment is actually probably scheduled to go away. We might not need it anymore." So,
That environment?
yeah,
Oh, I didn't realize we were still using that. Oh.
yeah, exactly. Um, Next up, you'll want to inventory the default environment. Because
Yeah.
even though people have the best of intentions, they may have still used the default environment for stuff that they shouldn't have. So you want to look and see, like, are there apps that have high usage, and see if those apps need to get pulled into different environments. And that's a hugely important thing. Second off, you'll want to see if any existing apps in the default environment fit into the strategy, or if like it requires some alteration to your strategy that it might need to happen. But yeah, there's probably something in your default environment that you don't exactly want working in the default environment. There might be data being kept in there that should be kept under better security, or apps that are more suited for a production environment, and they're getting held back by the default environment. Because a lot of times people will build a personal productivity tool in the default environment, and then share it with other people, and everybody else is like, "Hey, this is great," and then next thing you know, you know it's got 100 users, and it's, getting a little big for the default environment. So yeah, you might want to think about that.
Yeah, I feel like this slide could go on every single Power Platform best practice deck.
Yeah, anything and
Or
everything.
your
Yeah,
default environment,
right.
regardless of the topic.
Yeah,
This should be something you're doing.
no, completely. Then next up, you'll want to review connector usage, like what connectors are being used in the environments, and could they potentially have access to sensitive data, and or are they safe? If you've got high value things, you may not want that spitting, you know, out to other services, and it might be at risk of doing that. So you gotta think about that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want, for example, a Dataverse connector in Dev to be accessing production resources, and you don't want, for example, a production connector in, for SharePoint to be maybe you don't want that to be used in the same flow as an email that's being sent. You
Yeah.
gotta be aware of these things and make sure that you're securing it. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. And then finally, these are actually out of order. We have this graphic comes from Craig White, who is over at platformsofpower.net, and to whom this video owes a great debt. But um, he has a concept called t-shirt sizing for environments, where you'll start with extra small, and that's just the personal environment, might be your default environment. You might go up a little bit, your team needs an environment. Then, your department might need to start thinking about their own dev and UAT and their production environments, and then, your whole organization, and then eventually your super sensitive data. You got to think about all these sorts of things. So you might have growing needs as time grows, and obviously we're hoping business grows. So yeah. And then finally, a lot of the info from this video came from this article here. We'll put a link to it in the notes. But again, thanks to Craig White and Michael Roth, I believe, as well, for their really helpful article. And yeah, that's all we have for today.
All right. Yeah, I guess all the content here comes from some of those sources as well as our own personal pain and suffering from having done it
Yes,
wrong on enough
absolutely.
occasions.
Yeah, we've learned a lot of this the hard way. That's for sure. So, yeah. Anyway, thanks everybody for dropping in today, and we'll catch you in the next video.
All right, outstanding. Thank you, Garrett.
Yep.
Talk
Yep,
soon.
sure thing. Bye.